Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to tell you about our sponsor, which is the Great Courses Plus. This is what it looks like. It's an app on your phone right there. And this is the teaching company, the Great Courses, that I've been a fan of and consumer of for many years. And before, you had to go online and purchase a course and take the entire course, and that's all you got. Now, with the Great Courses Plus program, they have a subscription program. So if you subscribe, then you have access to hundreds of thousands of courses, and therefore tens of thousands of lectures. If you get tired of a course, just switch to another course. I do it all the time. I'll hit 2 or 3 or half a dozen lectures in a particular subject. I get bored, or I just want to try something different, and I'll switch to new one. So let's just see what pops up here, because they also are pretty current. So I hit that, and we get America's Long Struggle Against Slavery. Okay, it's pretty obvious why that's popped up now, as I'm recording this in the middle of the riots and looting and all that over the death of George Floyd. And so I touch on that, and then you get a list of the lectures to choose from. Understanding the fight against slavery, the origins of slavery in the British Empire, the African slave trade, and so on and so forth, all the way down. Slavery in the War for Independence, the Haitian Revolution. It looks like there is 30 lectures ending in slavery by another name, probably slave labor, and fighting modern slavery. So I'm going to listen to a few of those. The deal is, if you go to their site, the Great Courses, greatcoursesplus.com/salon, you get a free trial, and as a listener of my podcast. So I recommend it. I consume their lectures all the time, along with audiobooks, so I recommend that you do that. Perfect time in this era of social isolation. So with that, thanks for the support from the greatcoursesplus.com/salon. My guest today is Gerald Posner, one of my favorite authors. His new book is Pharma, subtitled Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Gerald Posner is an award-winning journalist who has written 12 books, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Case Closed, and multiple national bestsellers, including his 2015 book, God's Bankers, a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican, and that was an acclaimed New York Times bestseller. Posner has written for many national magazines and papers, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Newsweek, and Time. He's been a regular contributor to NBC, History Channel, CNN, CBS, MSNBC, Fox News. He lives in Miami Beach with his wife, author Tricia Posner. And for skeptics, you'll be familiar with Gerald Posner's work on Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination of JFK and the assassination of Martin Luther King. And he's kind of a conspiracy debunker. So in a way, this is an interesting book, because the scandals he uncovers in the big pharmaceutical companies is kind of those are kind of conspiracies that he's revealing to us. So I think that's kind of an interesting twist. Anyway, we get into the whole opioid crisis and why it happened, who's responsible, and really the whole history going back to the Civil War of the search for painkillers and so forth, and all the patent medicines and snake oils, and therefore we needed a regulatory state to control for the fraud, and then what that led to for the development of big pharma in the 60s and 70s, and all the way up to the present issue that we have here with the opioid crisis. So this is really one of the most important books I've read in a long time, in as much as we're right in the middle of one of these. And so we end talking about the COVID-19 crisis, vaccines, what he would say to an anti-vaxxer, how close we are to getting a COVID-19 vaccine. He's pretty confident of that, so that's encouraging. And so with that, I give you Gerald Posner. So first, I think the first time I encountered you was on a Nova show on Lee Harvey Oswald. I think that was late 90s, maybe early 2000s.
Yeah, that's probably right, because Case Closed came out in 93 on the 30th anniversary, and the Nova show was probably 2 or 3 years after that.
Yeah, and I think that was triggered by the Oliver Stone film, JFK. I was always a lone assassin guy, although like most people, I hadn't read the Warren Report, because it's whatever 20 volumes long, and And I just figured, yeah, that's kind of the way things work. The more people you have involved in a conspiracy, the less likely it is to be true and so on. But I have to admit, after watching Stone's film, I thought, boy, if only 10% of this is true, then there's got to be another shooter. That's a conspiracy. And this shows the power of storytelling in film. It's like, none of it was true. There's like 100 facts he got wrong or whatever, but it was such a compelling story.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that I owe Oliver Stone one thank you, which is that he ended up essentially getting the book deal for me. Random House had not been interested in a book that sort of re-examined the evidence on the case. Then the Stone film came out and re-energized the entire JFK assassination for the public. When I saw that film, he is a great filmmaker. He's just a lousy historian. And people would say to me the same thing you said. Well, even if only a small percentage of it is right, there's something wrong here. And I would say the only thing that Oliver Stone got right was the date on which Kennedy was assassinated.
Right.
You would think I was kidding, but when you go through it, that's the masterful power, I think, of presenting, what he called an alternative version of history, but in a way that it looks as though it's factual, cutting real scenes in with movie scenes, so it all floods into it. And most people are willing to take a 2.5-hour movie as their entire in-depth investigation on a subject of history. They're convinced something's wrong.
Yeah. And you did the same thing with the King killing and Ray and his background. And it kind of all adds up a little bit like Lee Harvey Oswald. The thing is, if you think about how an assassination like that could be pulled off, that, someone living in the nooks and crannies of a free society who's a nobody, that is who could get away with it. Not a big government agency with, hundreds of G-men running around pulling the strings. It's just nobody you don't notice.
That's exactly right. And it's interesting, Michael, because I say often, people think that because I conclude that Oswald alone killed Kennedy or that Ray alone killed King, that means also I don't believe in conspiracies. And I say to them, I have no doubt that there were conspiracies brewing against Jack Kennedy in the early 60s. Some group of mobsters who would have wanted him dead, some rogue group of agents who may have thought he was not good for the government. At any given time, there are plots probably brewing against an American president. Yeah. So when somebody then assassinates that president or that civil rights leader, we assume that they were doing it at the bidding of one of the conspiracy groups. That's not necessarily the case.
Right.
So conspiracies can be afoot, but in the end, also a lone assassin can get there before any of the conspirators get a chance to put their plot into effect.
Yeah, well, Lincoln was assassinated by conspiracy, but it came to light pretty quickly, like within a day, I guess.
That's right. And, you hit on something important. I didn't realize this until after the King book. I was so excited when the Killing the Dream came out, because I thought, although Ray had definitely killed King, there was a possibility that he'd worked with his brothers. They've always denied the crime, and maybe gotten some money from a racist out of the Midwest, a lawyer. I thought maybe there's a small little conspiracy here, but that's not what people think of as conspiracy in the modern age.
Yeah.
They think of conspiracy as meaning this deep state, secret government, lots of FBI agents, not a small kitchen conspiracy like that.
Yeah, I've been using your new book as an example in giving interviews about COVID-19 conspiracies, 5G and Bill Gates and, world domination and controlling the world population and forced vaccinations, and they're going to chip everybody. Well, first of all, I point out we are all already chipped voluntarily carrying around a cell phone. so much for that.
That's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting when you mention that. People often say when it comes to COVID, South Korea is the example of how great you can do contact tracing and everything else. Well, people should realize that people gave up a level of civil liberties we may not be willing to do in the United States. The South Korean government went to all the mobile phone companies and said, give us all the data.
Right.
But they knew if somebody turned positive, they were able to post up on a public site, not your name, but they would say that so-and-so at this address was positive and went to see this movie and was in the third row last Thursday, was at this grocery store on Tuesday in this line. So, you are right. We've chipped ourselves in essence. But I was surprised at the Bill Gates conspiracies. I'd heard about them before, but it wasn't until I published Pharma that people started to come out and really say, we think he's evil. We think this is a guy behind the entire movement. And I thought, well, no good deed shall go unpunished.
Right. Yeah, although he's been a target of conspiracy since the 90s. And I'm predicting Jeff Bezos will replace him as the biggest conspirator, because there was that article the other day. He may be the first person who's ever a trillionaire.
Yeah.
And that'll do it.
So I remember, and if that happens, I am going to have to hear from Tricia, my wife and also a writer. She will say, "I told you so," because she has said for a number of years, somebody will be a trillionaire. And I say, Tricia, that's impossible. You know how big that number is. It's not possible, but I may have to eat those words.
Yeah, if you end up with 90% of retail in one store, that could do it.
Happen.
But the other thing, about using pharma as an example, because people know what real conspiracies are like, and that's a real one. Pharmaceutical companies hack the FDA and the DEA and regulations and so on in order to gain a profit, or Volkswagen hacks the emission standards to gain a profit. People go, "Oh, yeah. I go, that's a real conspiracy. Very narrowly focused. The motives are obvious. We want to make more money. Not world domination, but want to make money, and that's really where you're targeting there."
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you see it time and time again in the DNA, the history of pharma. You see it in instances, like you said, on VW with emissions control. Corporations often do it for the money aspect. Occasionally, we have conspiracies for power, which is rather unusual. That was Nixon and that period, which was more consolidation. And that throws people off. We're used to them for money in the United States. We're not used to them as much for the accumulation of power. But those are conspiracies which we see all the time. And look, we understand there's a law, the RICO statute, in which government prosecutors bring ongoing criminal conspiracies, not just against the mafia, but they've used them also against businesses. So those conspiracies exist. They're just not the ones that make Oliver Stone want to make a movie.
Right. Well, God's Bankers, again, I haven't read that yet, but I presume that's something like a real behind the scenes, behind the doors conspiracy, conspiring to control money.
And there, I will just say that the real key becomes in the middle of World War II, the Vatican forms the Vatican Bank, 1942. So interesting, they never had a bank before, and it's sort of a cross between Goldman Sachs and, let's say, the Federal Reserve. The reason they formed the bank in the middle of the war is because we, the Americans and the British, have an enemies list. We're trying to stop trading with the enemy. And the Vatican is essentially Italian, 98% Italian, cardinals at the time, Italian Pope. So they have brothers literally on the other side of the wall from the Vatican who are fighting for Mussolini's army and allied with the Germans. So they are investing in German and Italian insurance companies. At the same time, they're investing in English property and American stocks. They're playing both sides of the ledger because they're not sure who's going to win. But when the war was over, they said, by the way, we didn't invest in the enemy at all. Never put any money in Germany or Italy. We just invested in the winners. And that's where the real story is on that.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I've been to the Vatican, and it is a treasure trove of probably stolen art and, all kinds of stuff. And I don't know have any idea what it's worth. What's the Vatican worth?
They, as a matter of fact, that's a great thing. They've downplayed the figures because they were worried for a while. As a matter of fact, there's one chapter on the financial impact of the pedophilia scandal and how the Vatican was afraid that some of the lawsuits in the United States or other countries might eventually try to bring the Pope into it as the overlord of all of the priests around the world. So they kept saying the art's really not worth that much. We think we have less than $1 billion here of all the art in the world. And so I'd love to have a real appraisal.
Yeah, no, that would be a trillionaire. Before we dive into the book topic itself, in your preface, I think it was your preface, you talk about your colleague kind of bemoaning the loss of shoe leather journalism and those kind of deep dives into investigations like what you've done. Do you think there's been kind of a move away from that just because of the changing economic landscapes of journalism in competition with social media?
Yeah, I think it's happened. And that conversation I had with Jim Phelan, he was the journalist who broke the case of the fake autobiography of Howard Hughes. Clifford Irving had done a fake. So that was his claim to fame. But he had a lot of good reporting. He used to be able to go out for the Saturday Evening Post for 2 or 3 months. Harry Evans, who was an editor for the Sunday Times, had a team that he let go out for 2, 3, 4 months on a case. They broke the DC-10, the thalidomide story. But sometimes they'd come back with nothing. No one, Michael, will run that risk anymore. The New York Times, the New Republic, Vanity Fair, wherever, they will not say to a journalist, okay, go off, see what you find, come back in a few months and tell me if you have something. Social media has made it even faster. You've got to have a story you want to pursue. It's a quick thing. You're able to go after it in 3, 4, 6 weeks on a magazine piece is fairly long. Some, Pulitzer Prize winning pieces will be longer than that. But in the book world, many houses want you to tell them before they sign a book what your conclusions are. And I always find that impossible. Right. I don't know what I'm going to find until I get out there.
Right.
So I consider myself very, very lucky to have in Simon & Schuster a publisher that said, pharmaceutical industry, Posner, okay, we'll take that risk. go out and see what you come back with. And 5 years later, I came back with a book they liked. But there's always a risk that your editor may leave. The publishing house might be sold and acquired by another company.
Right.
And suddenly the new owners won't be interested in the pharmaceutical industry and you'll be out on your own. But that's how I like to do it, the old-fashioned way, which is give me enough time, let me go out and see what I discover, and I'll find a story.
Yeah, you certainly did with this. The amount of sources you have on this was remarkable, and the stuff you dug up on the Sackler family. I don't think I'd ever heard of them until the opioid crisis really hit. And maybe the first time I heard about that was when Rush Limbaugh famously checked himself into a rehab center addicted to OxyContin, was it? I think.
That's right.
Maybe that was mid-90s or so. And everybody was hammering him because, conservatives are always, critical of liberals for being drug addicts and so on. It's just a matter of willpower. You just have to will yourself around this. And clearly that wasn't the case with Rush.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's, I guess what that proved is conservatives and liberals, progressives and right-wingers, everybody can get pain and they seek treatment for it. And Purdue knew that very, very well. Purdue being the company that was putting out OxyContin, the blockbuster painkiller that was owned by the Sackler family. And you're right, I didn't know much about the Sacklers. I read about them, I followed them, and I always thought, Michael, if I'm doing a history of the pharmaceutical industry, which originally was going to be World War II to today and then turns out being the late 1800s to today, the Sacklers and opioids will be a chapter or two. It's opioids. It's a big part of the story. I never thought they would be as much of the story as they are. And I had been looking early on for a through line. What I mean is I was hoping I'd find a family that went from, let's say, the 1940s to the current date, the Johnson & Johnsons or somebody in the Squibb family or Pfizer. And I'd be able to weave in and out, tell the story of pharma at the same time this story kept popping in and out. Turns out that the Sacklers surprised me. I only knew them from OxyContin, but then you realize the Sackler brothers who founded the company were involved in the early part of revolutionizing the advertising for the business as we know it from the 50s and on. And they provided that through story. Just the other day, as a matter of fact, when I was watching SpaceX take off on the very same space pad that Apollo 11 had launched for. Of course, it brings out to me the fact that in 1969, when that took off, Arthur Sackler, the patriarch of the family, was able to convince NASA that they should put on their spacecraft betadine, which is a disinfectant that they owned, because Michael Crichton, the famous novelist, had just published his first novel, Andromeda Strain. Everybody was worried about a microbe coming in from outer space that would wipe out the planet. So NASA did that, and Sackler then used that for tens of millions of dollars of free advertisement. Betadine became a cash cow for them. They produced pennies on the gallon and sold to hospitals, to the army in Vietnam, to everywhere. It's one of the brilliant Sackler ploys.
That's funny. I saw your tweet about that, and I thought, how's he going to connect this to this launch? I was like, oh, wow, I had no idea.
That's right. It's one of those great little connections you think impossible, but no, it works.
Well, so here's another through line for me on this book. I don't know if you can see this, hydrocodone. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep. And as you can hear, there's still plenty in there. So last year I got in a nasty bike crash and I kind of tweaked my neck, and I was having some neck issues anyway. So I had a disc fusion, C5, 6, and 7. And, but when I first got into the crash and I was at the ER and they gave me like 5 codeine pills or whatever, I'm like, 5? This isn't going to last. They go, sorry, dude, those are the new rules. And then I finally went home and I got a script and I got like 12 pills or whatever. And my wife went to pick them up. And then she comes back with 2 bottles. One is the hydrocodone. The other one was naloxone. And I'm like, what the hell is this? I didn't even know what it was. Like some nose spray. What do I need a nose spray for? And so I called the pharmacy and they go, we're required by California law you're not required to buy it, but we're required to put it on the script as you should buy it, and we recommend it, or what my wife didn't know. So I ended up with this. So the hydrocodone was like $5 because I'm on Medicare, but the naloxone was $75.
Yeah, that's really something. That's very interesting. And, I'm a California native, so I appreciate that California is a wonderful nanny state. It's one of the few, and it does require you to sort of protect yourself. So we went from a point where in the 70s, people were afraid of opioids because they thought they were too addictive, stay away from them. And then there was this reevaluation movement in the 80s by pain doctors. The whole idea of pain management came out and people said we underdiagnose pain and we think we've tarnished and tar and feathered opioids too badly. They're not that addictive. Now we come on the other side of this through the opioid crisis. And now we've gone to the other side where they give you a prescription for a possible opioid antagonist. At the same time, they give you the opioid prescription. They only give you 5 or 12 pills because they're afraid of giving you the 60 or 90 that they were giving just a few years earlier for back pain. So the problem today is that people with legitimate, serious pain problems have difficulty sometimes filling OxyContin or other hydrocodone products because the pharmacies aren't carrying them or view them with some suspicion, thinking they're going to divert it to the third market, to the street market, and that's a shame.
Yeah. Let me tell you my experience. So I don't know if it kills pain. It just sort of kind of makes you feel warm and glowy and good. I don't know if it's targeting where the pain is coming from in the neck or whatever. Or it's just my whole brain is saturated in this kind of feel good drug. I definitely felt good. I felt more energetic, like you, I'm a writer, and I could write for like a couple hours more a day when I would take one in the afternoon. I'm like, whoa, I like this. Can I have more? No. Well, okay. But I wasn't addicted. The moment I stopped, it was like, whatever. I just kind of forgot about it. But I think of myself as I guess I'm one of the lucky ones that didn't have the genes or the brain physiology for addiction. But presumably other people who do, they just have to take more or go to another drug. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's interesting because I think science and doctors are really trying to figure out that physiology and the DNA and the genetics of what makes one person so easily addicted after 1, 2, or 3 times with an opioid product, and other people able to take larger doses for a longer period of time for pain treatment and not have any problems at all at stopping. And you're right, it's a roll of the dice in part. So there's a bit of luck involved, and that was the good luck for you on that end, because I see instances in which other people do find. There's another thing on this, and this is where Purdue crossed the line repeatedly with the Sacklers. You would have a situation in which they were trying to have OxyContin prescribed for more general ailments. It used to be just an end-of-the-life terminal cancer pill. Now they're trying to expand it for things like back pain, osteoarthritis, accidents that you have doctors use as a first-line pain treatment. When patients would come back and report to the doctors that it really wasn't helping them that much, or that it ended after 6 or 8 hours instead of lasting the 12 hours, Purdue's advice was up the dosage. Oh, you're only giving them 20 milligrams, make it 40. And then they come back, they say, I still have some aching, make it 60. They had an 80 milligram. They had a 160 milligram, which was, for people like me would knock me completely out. So I think that was part, at a certain point, even if you're naturally resistant to becoming addictive, there's probably a certain level over a period of time that gives you a physiological dependence and then an addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the question then, so the bigger question for you then is, who's responsible for the crisis? So we have the pharmaceutical manufacturers, then you have what you might call the distribution line, say the sales and marketing people, all the way to the reps that are out there going to doctors' offices and giving them free samples, then the doctors writing the scripts, and then the patients themselves. Where do you kind of parse the percentage of responsibility?
So I actually say there are a lot of people to blame in the opioid crisis. So Purdue and the Sacklers have become the poster child for the crisis itself. But let me tell you, here's where I put the blame. First, there's the manufacturer. That's Purdue, but there are other big companies involved. Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, Teva. A number of companies have had opioid products. They're involved in litigation now. As a matter of fact, J&J was sued in Oklahoma under a public nuisance law because they buy from Tasmania 80% of the opioids grown there in terms of natural production and supplied to companies all over the world. So a lot of pharma companies have their hands in the manufacturing end.
Tasmania?
Tasmania is the source. It's fantastic. Of 80% of the prescription opioids that end up in the world come from crops that Johnson & Johnson subsidizes. And they just were fined. They were held for a $500 million verdict, reduced to $300 million just a few months ago in Oklahoma as a public nuisance law. Whoa. Don't worry, they'll appeal that for the next 5 years, but it's fantastic litigation. So you have the manufacturers. Then you have what you said, the sales forces, the promotion teams that go out. Now, in the case of opioids, since it's a controlled substance, they can't give free samples to the doctors. So what they do instead is they go out and they give them other trinkets that are seductive. They put them on the speakers bureau. They say, you want to get a $10,000? Do you want to fly to Bermuda, as a matter of fact, to talk to a group of people that may need some advice on how to do it at a hospital? They give out pharmaceutical swag, all the gifts and things like that, the dinners. And that doesn't necessarily bribe them, but it certainly makes them more seductive power. And then there are the other people responsible, the distributors who distribute the drug. And that they're multi-billion-dollar companies. They're among the top 50 biggest in the U.S. I'm talking Cardinal Health, American, Bergen, these companies that come in and they know exactly, by the way, Michael, if one pharmacy in a little town in Kentucky with 3,000 people is taking enough pills in 6 months to supply 1 million people, they know where that's going in a better way than the manufacturer knows. And they're not doing anything. There's the FDA, which is lazy about changing the label and restricting the refills for nearly a 7-year period. There are prosecutors in the state and federal level that go forward against Purdue and get them to plead guilty but pay a fine and don't bring any criminal charges against them. So, and there are pharmacists who overprescribe. There are pill mill doctors who run their surgeries as though it's really just a legal pill dispensing place. So there is blame to go around for the opioid crisis across the board. I leave the patients out of it, what I call the victims in the end, because although they're the end chain, they're the buyers, they're the people getting fed the drug. There's so many layers before them that are holding some responsibility in making real money. I have plenty of blame to go around on this.
Yeah, I do preserve an element of volition and free will in people, but the degrees of freedom goes down dramatically if you are genetically inclined to addiction. My father was an alcoholic. One of my siblings is. His brother was. Their father was. I'm not. I just feel like I got lucky.
Right.
And I think that's the better way to think of it in terms of the patients. For a couple of years, I was a caretaker for my stepfather. So in his through maybe 6 years in his 80s before he died in 86, I would take him around to doctors. And here I want to give the doctors cut him a little bit of slack because he had aches and pains and he would complain and they couldn't pinpoint any particular thing. And you know how the medical care system works. You get like 8 minutes with this doctor, right? So my dad is like, no, doc, I got this and that, and I just feel like crap, and I can't get up. Can you just give me something? And this poor guy, he's trying to figure out what's wrong with my dad. He's finally like, here's a script. This will make you feel better, and it made him feel better. I'm like, okay, I kind of see how this works.
No, absolutely, you're right. And I think that one of the things that happened with Purdue and the OxyContin crisis, the opioid crisis, was that the drugs became acceptable because they were so widely available. You were on a high school football team and you had an injury and the doctor gave you a prescription for it at 16 or 17 years of age. Your friends had it. They were using it. Then it develops into something of a party drug for some people. But even pain, think of where Purdue first marketed the drug. They went into the heartland. They went to West Virginia. They went into Arkansas. They went into Appalachia, not because they thought the people were distressed and would want it, but they knew those were areas in which you had coal miners, factory workers, people doing hard blue-collar jobs where there was pain, they had suffering. They were looking for a way to continue to work at these jobs as long as they could and also have some relief stronger than Advil or some aspirin. So they were smart in their marketing from the beginning. They didn't go to the college towns in Santa Barbara or, in Rhode Island and say, you want to take some of these. They went to hardworking Americans and said, we can help you out. You can work harder, work longer, and last longer at your job with these drugs. And so there was a seductive element to it.
Yeah. So, and then Sackler also emerged as sort of the thread through your book because they were a private company and not publicly traded? Therefore, they were able to cover up a lot of their sins, shall we call them?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you understand that right away. You get a public company, things are much more transparent, and there may be something that goes wrong. We see it all the time, and they'll pay a fine, and the people involved in it will get purged from it. But in a private company, you're not quite sure what's taking place. But the real reason the Sacklers became a larger part of the story is the happenstance, the serendipity of research. So I do what I always do. My projects take so long, I get to apply for freedom of information requests.
Yeah. I love that.
And most authors say, oh, no, forget that. It takes a year or two. I say, so as long as you send them off early, it's fine. And I send them not just to the FDA. I think a lot of previous authors had probably said Sacklers, Purdue, OxyContin, FDA. We'll look through all that. I send it also to the FBI. I send it to all types of agencies. And the FBI sent back a treasure trove of documents. I didn't know that the Sacklers had been card-carrying members, two of them, of the American Communist Party from the late 40s and early 50s, at a time when it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to be a member during the Joe McCarthy era, the Red Scare, that Arthur Sackler, the patriarch, used his advertising firms as safe haven for journalists who had been blacklisted at the New York Times, LA Times, and others for having refused to answer the question before Congress of whether they were members of the Communist Party or not. He would give them a job when they got fired from their papers. And the FBI investigated the Sacklers for 20 years, even once for espionage, possible espionage, looked at them. They had all types of connections, even to Americans who turned out to be Soviet spies. And although they never proved to be people that they brought charges against, Arthur Sackler was testifying before the Senate in 1962, and I found Senate files that talked about a Sackler empire with the Byzantine charts of their companies. This is 44 years before anyone heard of OxyContin.
Right.
And then you realize that, how they revolutionized what I call the advertising trade, because when Sackler went to Pfizer in the 1950s and said, I think if you give me $7 to $10 million, which is an enormous amount of money, I can make this antibiotic you have a #1 bestseller, which he did. They said, but why? We're only selling to doctors. They don't sell to patients. I get it. We only advertise to doctors at that point. And all they were sending to doctors was the equivalent in JAMA, Journal of Medical, American Medical Association, and other journals. It almost looked like a photocopy of the drug insert label. It was pretty boring advertising. Sackler said, let's do 4-color ads. Let's do double-page spreads. Let's tell stories about women fighting off loneliness when it comes to Valium and other things. And they questioned that, but he made them spend millions and made the returns bigger. So it's Arthur Sackler who makes Valium for Hoffman La Roche, the first $100 million drug in the business and the first $1 billion drug. It holds the #1 selling spot for 15 years. That's an unrivaled number, never matched by any other drug. That's all Sackler's handiwork. It's really a remarkable tale.
And that's decades before the opioids.
Yeah, absolutely. He knew how to, Michael, he knew how to market, and he even marketed to men and women differently. So he had his companies like Hoffman La Roche that he was doing the advertising for sell the tranquilizers or mild anxiety pills like Valium or Librium to men so that you could be better in the workforce. You could go out, earn all the money for the family, be strong, not show any weakness, and you won't get an ulcer. To women, they were just hysterical and neurotic. And so they were sold to women so that if you were 35 single, you wouldn't get too stressed out about it. If you're getting near menopause, you could take a mild anti-anxiety pill. And what was the result of all of that work is that through the 1960s, on average, women made up about 2/3 of all the prescriptions filled for barbiturates, about 70% of all the prescriptions filled for anti-anxiety in the first generation of tranquilizers. So that marketing was successful at a time when most doctors were men and were dispensing those prescriptions.
Right. So interesting, the stuff you uncovered about Arthur Sackler's political orientation. If I can summarize it, he went from kind of a far-left Bernie-type socialist, interested in social justice issues and helping to make the world a better place, to Gordon Gekko, and greed is good. How do you explain that sort of transition?
I wish that I had more of the personal insight into Arthur Sackler as that transition took place. And I do have here access to a rather remarkable private memoir that was written by his second wife, also a psychiatrist, a German psychiatrist.
Right.
And she provides some look into his compulsive collection and work and what made him also have one of the greatest art collections of Asian art ever. But it's not clear when that move takes place for all the brothers, because these brothers clearly were committed. Sackler put himself at some considerable risk by having those, what I call blacklisted journalists working at his firm. He, in World War II, did some public work arguing against the Red Cross segregating black and white blood, which they used to do, which he thought was crazy. His two brothers were dismissed from Creedmoor, the largest state institution in New York psychiatric asylum, because they had leftist feelings and the communists and the FBI had found their communist leanings. So the Sacklers had put themselves at some personal risk. Yet what is interesting about it is that after the late 60s and early 70s, it disappears and they put their focus just on accumulating wealth and on their businesses. And as successful as they are there, the more they get in terms of their success, the politics just fade into the background and you don't see it anymore.
Yeah. The impression I get about him from reading your book is he's a very competitive, driven, kind of alpha male kind of guy. Maybe a little narcissistic. And in our system, the pursuit of money and in the competition of the marketplace is kind of the way to express that. Maybe if he'd been an athlete, he'd just been a successful, jock instead of entrepreneur or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. He had all the qualities you need for success in a capitalist system, and he did it very, very well. The thing about Sackler, which is hard sometimes to fathom, is he was doing something that all the three brothers were. There were three of them, all psychiatrist brothers, by the way. I think it's unusual. First generation Americans of Eastern European immigrants who are raised in Brooklyn. One, Arthur Sackler goes to medical school in New York at NYU. The other two have to go off to Glasgow because the quota for Jewish students was filled on the years that they applied.
Unbelievable.
This was the time you couldn't get into the school. They had a small number. Blacks and Jews allowed only in the smallest numbers. If those quotas were filled out, you had to go elsewhere. So two of the Sackler brothers go abroad. They all become psychiatrists. And what is interesting is they aren't just, though, business people who have that alpha male characteristic, but they are also clever in that they are doing dozens of companies. They're holding secret interests and stakes in companies in which they don't want that to be known because those companies are apparently competing for the same grant a school is giving out or for the government is. They have interest in companies that are doing prescribing information, finding out which doctors are the heavy prescribers, but they don't want to let somebody else know because maybe a client won't like that. So they have their fingers in a lot of different pies. Nothing illegal about it, but they were very, very clever in a way, not in a way that made them almost stand out. There were other people doing it, but the Sacklers were unique because if it wasn't for OxyContin, they would have flown under the radar, possibly forever. They would be a very wealthy family, not as wealthy as they are today, but they wouldn't be held up as the examples of what's wrong with the pharmaceutical industry.
I mean, based on their previous drugs like the barbiturates and Valium and those kinds of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs?
Well, the great thing was on those drugs, they just sold them. So the Sacklers had the best of all worlds. The drugs are made by Hoffman and LaRoche, for instance, on Librium and Valium. The Sacklers came in with the idea of how you could actually go ahead and sell it. So it was Arthur Sackler that did the double-page spreads. It was Sackler who actually, even in the 50s, when he was called up before the Senate, in Time magazine, he had put in a color insert in the middle of Time. Now, at that point, you weren't supposed to advertise to consumers. That wasn't allowed to 1997. So the Senate asked him, well, why did you then advertise in Time magazine? Because that's a consumer magazine. And he said, no. He was able to show that nearly 70% of the professional prescriptions went out to doctors' offices. And he had a perforated edge along the ad. So he expected doctors to rip the ad out before they put it out in the waiting room for patients. Now, that never happened. So he was working every angle that he could.
Yeah, interesting you say what they did wasn't illegal, but it is kind of on the margins there. And I was thinking about when I was at Pepperdine and I went through my Ayn Rand phase, like everybody does in college, and objectivism and anarcho-libertarian. We don't need the government. What about the FDA? Oh, we'll have private, regulatory agencies or whatever. And then I grew out of that, thought, no, that would be a bad idea for medications. But after reading your book, I thought, if you have enough money and lawyers, you can work around regulatory agencies pretty well. And that's what these guys did.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And, the regulatory agencies are often catching up after the fact. So they're catching up to the last disaster. They did that with thalidomide. We did it in the 1950s with the Salk vaccine for polio when a batch went out that was contaminated. And then afterwards, we built up the vaccine department inside the FDA. So time and time again, something happens. Then the response is to build up that section of the FDA. But you're right. The FDA is understaffed most of the time. It's fighting the pharmaceutical companies with one hand tied behind their back because there's too much work for them to do. And the way that pharma works is there's always an angle around it. So even with Sackler, he was running ads that only came out later. They would run ads for a drug that showed x-rays of two people. One of them you would look at as a person. You think that's the person sick before the drug because their chest is fully, and the other one is a clear chest. It turned out that they weren't of the same person, and neither one had actually taken the drug. And when he was called on that by the Senate, he said, well, it doesn't say anywhere they're the same person or they've taken the drug. It was just for illustrative purposes. Now, what you're saying is right. It goes right up to the line. It's something where you say, okay, we're arresting you now. We're making a citizen's arrest and bringing you in. But the FDA later responded to writing regulations that were tougher to close that loophole up. But if you want to, if you're clever enough, you have enough money, and these companies have big departments figuring out how to get through the drug approval process, you make it very tough for the regulators to stay ahead of you.
Yeah, it's like in my sport, cycling, the drug takers were always a step ahead of the drug testers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also I could see the logic of it of, let's say, in using today's dollars, you graduate from law school and you have an offer to work for the FDA, $100,000 a year. And some pharmaceutical company says, we'll hire you for $200,000 a year, $300,000 a year. Well, I'm going with that one. I think they're going to draw the talent more than the FDA would.
Well, and that happens, in every part of government service. It's a real problem. And I don't know how you stop it unless you put on something like a 5-year embargo that says you can't, when you leave government service, you can't go for 5 years to any of the companies you were regulating or investigating.
Right.
So the U.S. Attorney's Office, a perfect example. you're a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Sometimes when they leave, they go to the biggest defense firms, who are on the other side of cases that they were dealing with before. Nothing wrong with it, but that's where the money is worth it to them. And the same thing with the FDA. So, I write a chapter about something I knew almost nothing about before I got into the book, so-called orphan drugs. This unusual little aspect of drugs that are meant to treat small patient populations of people with rare genetic disorders. And the pharmaceutical companies have learned how to essentially game it so that most of the most expensive medications are today so-called orphan drugs, and they return enormous profits. It turns out that the first two companies, this was a law passed in the early 80s, that really formed to help drug companies figure out how to game the system were by FDA officials who had helped enforce and implement the law and then set up their own consulting firms and advertise themselves to say, we can help you on the orphan drug approval process. Now, nothing wrong, no under-the-table payments, nothing barring it, but this is why people get skeptical about the system. They jaundiced eye to it, cynical about the system. They think it's all one big door serving one another.
Yeah. So let's go back to the 19th century. You start with the demand for antiseptics and painkillers for combat troops. I knew nothing about any of this Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and just this kind of demand for something to treat these soldiers.
The great thing about doing a book project, and I love this so much, is that I get the chance to find out in detail about something I know only about in passing. And so this book had so many surprises for me as a subject. And one of them was what you just mentioned. Of course, it makes sense that we knew very little about medicine, what caused diseases, what transferred diseases, or really what cured diseases. So the 19th century is filled with these things called patent remedies, which are really all the illegal drugs at the time. Technically, they were all legal. Morphine, heroin, which Bayer comes out with later, cocaine, cannabis, and so opioids, and alcohol. In the middle of the 19th century, Civil War takes place, and there's a boom all of a sudden. The one thing we do know is morphine works to stop pain. So that boom causes the American pharmaceutical industry to start. Two German cousins in Brooklyn, $1,000 and a $1,500 loan. The Pfizer cousins start Pfizer, and Edward Robinson Squibb is a former Union colonel who understands the importance of morphine and starts his eponymously named company. You have Wellville and Manville who end up going over to England. Park Davis are real people, one a Detroit official and one a PR fellow. So these companies all come out of the pain field of morphine. And through the end of until the 1900s, the early 1906, when the first regulatory drug is passed, the Pure Food and Drug Act, it is really a wild west of all types of remedies that are promised as cure-alls. And in the end, they cure almost nothing. And the regulation that's passed in 1905, 1906 doesn't stop anything, because it's not until 1914, when the Harrison Act is passed, that we then outlaw all the narcotics. So at that point, morphine, heroin, cocaine, cannabis are all outlawed. Then we have the great experiment with prohibition. Alcohol's gone. And at that point, the drug industry can't put out any of the drugs that it was relying on for the last 50 years. It has to come up with something new. So it comes up with insulin in 1922, a great discovery, but it's really penicillin in World War II that changes it to what we know as the modern pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Now, in their defense, they would say something like, because you've set up this regulatory state, and we have to jump through so many hurdles, it costs us, $100 billion to bring a drug to market. We have to charge these outrageous prices.
Okay, so this is the great part of that. I love these two parts. So first of all, until 1938, you didn't even need a prescription. So whatever you wanted, you just walked into a store and got it. No prescriptions required for anything, including hard drugs, morphine, whatever else. Now in 1938, they started to control some of the pain medications for the first time. Through until 1962, there were no tests required for the efficacy of a medication. So all that was tested was that it was safe in a broad sense. It wasn't killing anybody. They didn't do extensive tests to see the safety, but as long as the drug wasn't causing you to grow a second head or a drop over dead after you took it 10 minutes later, got on the market. Now, if you said that it helped cure pain or headaches or brought down diabetes or controlled diabetes, you didn't have to prove efficacy. They didn't spend any money at that point. They were making all their money just on putting the drugs out. After 62, we had a scare over thalidomide. And that's what an over-the-counter drug that was marketed in Europe, mainly toward women who were pregnant for morning sickness. It turned out to have horrible birth deformities on many of the children. It had not been put out in the USA because an FDA officer, Frances Kelsey, had slowed the process up, not knowing what was taking place, but she had some doubts. And as a result, everyone said, the FDA is our savior. and emboldened them with all types of powers, gave them powers now to have the efficacy trials. What we hear is clinical trials, 1, 2, and 3. We hear them with COVID for the vaccine. The drug companies have said since that day in 62, Michael, you've cut into our profits. All this money spent on research and development. Now, there's no doubt it takes them a much longer time, and they do spend a lot of money on research and development. But my favorite personal stat, I think in the book for maybe the last chapter or two, is that as of 2019, if you go back to 2010, so nearly a decade, the top 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, all public companies, spend more on promotion and marketing and stock buybacks than they spend on drug development.
Wow.
So yes, they spend a lot on drug development, but they also spend a lot on selling it, marketing it, and keeping their share prices high.
Wow. That is staggering. You had a lot of interesting numbers in there. 20% of all children died before the age of 5. I think that was all the way up to the 1900 or so.
A remarkably high number. And, you think about it, so little was understood. I mean, one of the big sellers in terms of drugs in the business was something called Cop's Baby Soother. Mothers were buying it in big numbers because it kept your baby quiet overnight. And new mothers, with 3 children at home in a small place would say, that's great. It turned out it was 1/3 pure opium. And after they pieced together some deaths around the country, that may have contributed to the 20% of children dying under the age of 5.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, desperate parents are, willing to try almost anything to stop the pain. Yeah.
But think of this, I mean, it is interesting that one of, you say little tidbits, but here you have German pharmaceutical companies led the way. They were ahead of American companies. And at the start of World War II, in 1939, about 43% of all the drugs sold in the world came from German pharma. In 1946, after the war, 10 American firms had 80% of the business because we had decimated the German pharmaceutical bombed them to smithereens. So there was a change in the business. Bayer, which had been in the business for a long time, over a 4-year period from 1898 to 1902, their scientists came up with 4 drugs inside the lab. They discovered first in 1898 acetaminophen. We know it as Tylenol. All right. The next year, they came up with bufferin or aspirin. Actually, aspirin was their next drug. Then they came up with heroin in 1900, literally trademarked as heroin after the German Heroisch for heroic. And then in 1903, they invented the entire class of barbiturates. Their branded name was phenobarbital. So they have 4 major drugs. And this, my favorite part is they only failed to put one of them out because it was too toxic in the lab, and that was acetaminophen. So they never marketed Tylenol because they thought that was too toxic, but they did put out heroin, phenobarbital, and aspirin. So, I love some of those early decisions.
Yeah. So just on a time frame schedule, when were we pretty confident that these drugs are addictive and can kill people versus in other words, when did they know and keep selling? The ignorance factor is tough to figure out in the early 1900s because we don't have what we do today, which is a trail of emails and government records, and let's go and do a FOIA request and find out what they were saying to each other. What I do know, and I have to assume that they were telling the truth in the beginning, Bayer, when it marketed heroin, marketed it as a cure for opium addiction and for morphine addiction because it said the reasoning was this: you need a higher amount of morphine or opium to relieve the pain. In heroin, you'll be able to relieve pain in a smaller amount, and you'll be able, therefore, not to need it for as long a time, take as much, and you'll get off faster. And, I have a chapter in there on Cicely Saunders, who's the British nurse who formed the hospice movement in the 1960s. Right.
She was using heroin, legal heroin, on her end-of-life patients, terminal cancer care, and it was the most effective pain reliever. There was no doubt. She believed that in some instances, that in her own study, that people did not become addicted to it, although obviously there wasn't a long lifespan on some of the hospice patients. It was Cicely Saunders who was looking for a longer-acting version of heroin because, unfortunately, unfortunately for her, it had to be dosed every 4 to 6 hours because otherwise patients would get pain back. And as a result, they had to stay in the hospice or in the hospital. She was looking for something that would be longer lasting so they could be sent home for their final days. And who filled her request? But the Sackler brothers and their English subsidiary, NAP Pharmaceuticals, came up with the first extended release morphine product called OxyContin. And that sort of revolutionized the hospice movement in the 1970s. So you see these connections that take place one after the other. I don't think that drug companies knew necessarily that what they were marketing was bad and terrible from the start. They thought of it as somehow offering a benefit, therapeutic efficacy, or somehow benefit with the earlier generation. But then once they sometimes learned about the bad side effects, they pushed those aside in the pursuit of sales.
Yes. Well, if you're sending somebody home to die in a few days or weeks, you're not thinking about addiction anyway. Who cares? Just, reduce the suffering.
That's right. But what did we do here in America? So when we got a hospice in America, now in Medicare, for instance, you're allowed to get hospice, but you have to be re-qualified for hospice every 6 months. Now you say to me, every 6 months. I thought it was end of life. So sometimes doctors get it wrong. How many times, Michael, have you heard somebody say, I was told I had 2 weeks to live,
right.
and here I am 7 years later. So sometimes
right.
doctors don't get it right. But it's interesting that in America, as long as a doctor says they believe you're in a terminal state, you can get it renewed 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. So there are some people in hospice here for a couple of years in the States on long-term pain medication that otherwise you think would be debilitating. What used to be thought of as a few weeks has become longer term in some instances.
Yeah, I like the section in your book about the rise of the idea of pain as a measure, a quantifiable measure that should go along with blood pressure and the other measures, because it is hard to quantify. It's an internal state. There's nothing you can measure physiologically, really, unless there was some brain scan to see or something like that. So you just say on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? Well, I don't know, a 6.
It's fascinating that.
And then take this, and now I'm a 3. Okay, is that good? I don't know.
It's all relative. And so what's fascinating is the same as mind drugs, if you think about anti-anxiety or depression medications, unless it's an instance in which somebody has identifiable schizophrenia and is hearing voices or things like that. It's often a matter of listening to what the patient says. Are they clinically depressed? Are they not? Do they have anxiety they suffer from so great that they might need a prescription pill? So you're interpreting it. There's no real scale. And these pain doctors in the 80s, who were really palliative care cancer doctors, said pain is greatly underdiagnosed because doctors before that would treat pain as a symptom of some other condition. You'd go in and say, I'm in terrible pain. And they would say, did you fall off your bike? Were you cycling? Did you hurt yourself? Maybe there's a tumor involved underneath. These doctors said, no, pain is a condition on its own. And so therefore you have to ask people, take it with their heart. It's one of the 5 metrics now, the 5 basic diagnostic signs. What's your pain? Scale of 1 to 10. Where is it? And then treat that on its own. And that helped fuel the easy availability of opioids because we had pain being treated at the same time. We had a belief taking place in a lot of doctors that opioids weren't that bad if they were given for pain only. So as long as you didn't take it for that euphoria feeling that you were feeling when you first got that. And the Sacklers made a very, very good pitch on this. They convinced the FDA of something remarkable. The Sacklers put over their hydrocodone. They called it OxyContin as the brand name. An invisible polymer, 12-hour slow dissolve coating, so that instead of it dissolving in 3 or 4 hours, instead of getting the rush of all of the opioid ingredient, the hydrocodone that's in the pill right away, you get it slowly. So the Sacklers said to the FDA, that means people are less likely to abuse it, less likely to become dependent over the long run. The FDA had no studies, nor did the Sacklers, to prove that, but they put it on the original label. They said less likely to cause dependence or to cause addiction. So doctors thought it was a safer narcotic opioid. It turns out it wasn't. You could still crush the tablet and get all the dose of opioids at once. You could still take more of them than you were supposed to and get a high. So in the end, it was just as dangerous as anything else. That idea of a slow release did not help much at all.
Yeah, I remember when I got my script for hydrocodone and another time, and they said, it was when I called them about the naloxone, and I said, well, they go, well, in case you take them all at once. I said, what kind of idiot would take them all at once? They go, you'd be surprised.
Yeah, no, I think it's remarkable that the number of people that will take an amount of opioids that you would think otherwise would kill you. And, one of the things when you say that is it's interesting because, I received a brown manila envelope late in my research that ended up having inside what purported to be a DEA document that was part of a fight. It turned out I was able to verify it. The DEA was having a squabble with the FDA, the 2 regulatory agencies, in 2001, 2002 over OxyContin. The DEA wanted to regulate it more strictly because it said it's on the street, it's a street drug, it's being diverted, we have to do something about it. The FDA said it's a legal drug, we're doing as much as we should. The part of this that's interesting is the DEA tried to convince the FDA by showing them autopsy information that they had gathered from medical examiners to say all these people are dying of OxyContin. And Purdue's defense was, no. all those deaths, there's OxyContin, but there's also beer, and there's a little alcohol, and there's a benzodiazepine, and it looks like there's a little bit of cocaine, because very seldom are somebody taking the entire bottle, as you said, of OxyContin, and that's it. If somebody's abusing an opioid, they're often abusing other drugs, or they're taking something else. That's you get the Elvis Presley autopsy, as I call it, cornucopia of drugs.
Yeah.
And so Purdue was able to dodge responsibility for a number of years by saying, how do you know OxyContin killed them? Maybe other drugs were what put him over the edge.
Yeah, or some combination. Yeah, you had Elvis's diagnosis or his autopsy in there, didn't you? That was like, holy crap, he took a lot of drugs. And Marilyn, too, I think.
Marilyn as well, and even Jack Kennedy.
Right. I mean,
Jack Kennedy had a doctor, a German doctor, later called Dr. Feelgood. He was a doctor to stars as well, and he one of, as a matter of fact, Sackler's latest drugs that he was promoting, Librium, was used by Jack Kennedy. It was approved in 1960, but he was also taking an amphetamine to counterbalance the adrenal insufficiency that he had that we didn't know about with Addison's and Graves' disease. So Kennedy was I'm glad to note now, after the fact, not at the time, that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I remember as an 8-year-old kid getting under my desk in San Francisco and practicing the nuclear holocaust that was going to come.
Yeah.
I would have been a little afraid to know that our president was taking an amphetamine that might charge him up a little bit.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. Even this, you just mentioned 1980s that we started studying pain. 1980s? I mean, we were adults. What? That's pretty late in the game.
That is very, I was absolutely flabbergasted that the whole area of pain management really didn't exist. There wasn't even oncology until 1980 and on. So we think of the cancer care treatment as such a field. The specialization of medicine has become so precise. And this idea really, and that's where pain management comes from in the 80s, because the idea that pain is a standalone disease. So that's why you go to a pain management doctor today to deal with the pain. And they'll see if they want to do a test for something else. But you're right, never existed beforehand.
That guy just died a few weeks ago. That the gate theory of pain, that if your pain is down there and you block it up here, you've solved the problem because it doesn't get to the brain. Anyway, it's just and that was pretty new.
Fantastic. There's always, I think everybody who's had pain is one of the biggest untreated, issues in America, and people are often suckers for everything. We see it the supplement industry, which is unregulated. It's sort of like the patent drug industry beforehand. Supplements can be sold and claimed just about anything. I see an ad every other day, it seems, on TV for some new ointment that's out that will alleviate all your pain to the end. Don't worry, arthritis, hardly move, sore back, a lot of work. Try this at Walgreens, and you rub it on, it'll be absolutely fine. It's a big market.
Yeah, another subject on the replication crisis. So many of those experiments that are unable to be replicated, besides the social psych ones that are kind of cutesy, are all the biomedical ones, because it's hard to prove causality in these complex systems inside the body. And as you mentioned, you have this one factor, the drug, but there could be 20 other things that's going on inside there. So you can see why the FDA has a hard time regulating this. Companies themselves have a hard time proving or disproving harm of their drugs and so on, because they're complex systems.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And then here's though where it crosses the line on companies is they have a hard time proving it. They may not know. They market the drug comes out, and then they start to get adverse effect reports back from the field. And instead of acting on them or reporting them to the government, they sit on them. So Purdue did that with OxyContin. They got 1,100 such reports of adverse effects and overdose in this 1 year period. Didn't report one. In the 1960s, when the first oral contraceptive was put out by Cyril, they were getting accumulating reports through the mid-60s and late 60s of women who were suffering from blood clots and also incidents of what looked like cancer, uterine cancer. They said, well, maybe it's not due to the pill. It wasn't until 1975, when the Senate did investigations with Gaylord Nelson, the senator, that they realized they were sitting on reports that should have raised the red flag years earlier. The same thing with hormone pills, Prempro, which was used for menopause. Hormone levels so high, much higher level of cancer incidence, and Cyril was bearing those reports. So the problem comes when the drug company gets the information, and instead of figuring out we should report it and make the drug better, they think maybe no one will notice. And then eventually it does become public, and everybody loses faith in the drug industry as a whole because they think it's widespread.
Yeah, that takes us back to conspiracies, like the tobacco companies saying, well, you haven't really proven causality. And we need more science. The jury is still out. at some point that, what jury where, we know.
Yeah, that's right. And so, it's very interesting you say that. I mean, one of the companies that had a sterling reputation, the longest reputation that was good, and I write about them in the 70s, they were still run by a doctor, was Merck. Merck had sort of this contrary view. We're a quasi-public trust almost. We come up with cures, the profits will follow. Sort of an antiquated view in the drug industry. And they even gave away one of their drugs for river blindness to the third world when they realized it couldn't be had. But when Vioxx came around, that was a star drug for them, a big seller on helping on osteoarthritis. As the reports were filtering in about incidents with heart attack or adverse heart effect, they were putting them into a separate file, never to see the light of day. And eventually, as with everything, as you know, there can't be a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination because eventually it comes out. And it just looks like the type of thing that you look back on. And here's the thing I think the pharmaceutical companies have gotten away with for the most part. They get caught not disclosing the injuries beforehand. And what happens to them? They pay an enormous fine, $3.5 billion. The numbers are staggering. We think that'll teach them a lesson. But it's the cost of doing business. If they've made OxyContin returned $35 billion in sales to the Sacklers from when it went on sale in 1996. They paid a $660 million fine in 2007 for having mismarketed. So that's the cost of doing business. If you're not dealing with jail sentences eventually for some executives that might have crossed the line,
let's crunch that number for a second. So it's 600 out of 3,600. Right. So you're talking, what is it, 6% or something? I mean, it's a tiny fraction.
It's a tiny fraction.
So that you could just build into the cost of doing business, I guess. So it's no longer a punishment.
That's right. It's a punishment in the sense that you've taken away their profit margin. All right. They love the fact of being able to say a 40% profit margin on this drug. It costs us nothing to make. And now you have a $2 billion fine on a drug like Vioxx, and you've really reduced that overall profit. But the thing that's amazing is
16%. Sorry, I misspoke. 16%. Okay.
Yes. But the 600 million versus 36 billion.
36 billion. Oh, right.
Yeah.
No. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's 0.1. So 1.6%. Okay, it's nothing.
Yeah, amazing. It's nothing. It's really for them nothing. And I think that the thing is, and sometimes the pharmaceutical industry. So, for instance, with the polio vaccine in the mid-50s, one of the 4 companies selected by the U.S. government to manufacture the vaccine, Cutter Labs, which makes those sprays like Cutter anti-bug sprays and mosquito sprays, they didn't do the formulation right with formaldehyde that Jonas Salk had given them, and they sent out batches with live vaccine. 55,000 children got sick in 10 Western states. A couple of hundred were paralyzed, and like a dozen died. Bad result. However, they had been given immunity by the government for anything they did wrong, including coming up with a poisonous batch of the vaccine. The same thing happened in 1976 with the swine flu. You remember under Gerald Ford, we thought there was going to be a swine flu outbreak. 40 million people ended up getting vaccinated. The drug companies asked for complete indemnity. They got it. And in the end, when the lawsuits came in, over 4,000 of them for Guillain-Barré, this neurological syndrome that nobody knew could develop, we had a dozen lawyers in the Justice Department handling these full-time, ending up spending a couple of $2 billion and settling it. So my feeling is that not only sometimes, Michael, do we have a situation in which the drug companies pay a fine to get away with bad behavior, but in other cases in which the public health is at risk, like a vaccine, they get the government to carry their water for them. It's really remarkable.
It is incredible. Let's talk about some of the good news stories like the polio vaccine, penicillin, streptomycin, the AIDS drugs, and of course, Viagra, the best of all. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, the Viagra is in the book as one of those drugs that they discover through the side effect of the drug. So sometimes they do that. A nurse going around and looking at the men who were on the initial trials, really for blood pressure, found out that one of the side effects is that it would cause an erection. And they saw, and they weren't sure, by the way, at the company that would really make much of a difference in terms of marketing until they realized that they could create the field of erectile dysfunction. Right. It became one of the biggest sellers ever. But there are a number of drugs like that where they find out through a side effect what happened. But even in the best of stories, and there are some good stories, there are people inside the lab. Jonas Salk, who comes up with the polio vaccine, is asked by Edward R. Murrow in a CBS radio interview, who owns this? Do you own the rights to it, or the drug company own the patent rights? And he said, could you patent the sun? I mean, this belongs to everybody. Now, he's unusual. Yes. Not a lot of people are like that. Nobody owned the rights to penicillin. It was a crash government program. And when you talk, though, about things like AIDS drugs, a perfect example, there's a public-private partnership here. We, the taxpayers, support the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. They provide a lot of money for research. Since the late 1930s 2019, over $900 billion in public research that goes out to drug companies. AIDS, a perfect example. So researchers at the NIH are looking around in 83, 84 for a drug they think might be able to treat it, an antiviral. And one of the researchers says, Burroughs, they have a drug that might work. They went to Burroughs and said, could we have that drug to test it at the NIH? Now, that drug wasn't used by Burroughs. They had a patent on it, but they didn't use it because it was too toxic. Burroughs didn't even know, Michael, how to make the drug anymore. The NIH had to help them make the compound. They then provided to the NIH, who do a year of studies, some private funding from San Francisco, and that's AZT, the first effective drug to treat. So what does Burroughs then do? It says, okay, we want the drug back, and we're going to patent it. And the government says, no, we've done all the research. We're going to make this available for everybody. Burroughs went to court, won the suit, and they priced AZT at $12,000 a patient. It was then the most expensive drug in the world. Wow. AIDS activists and ACT UP protested, and they lowered the price to $10,000. So my point, and they made $2 billion in the first 2 years. No money came back to the NIH. So even on the so-called good stories, like the development of a drug to treat AIDS, the profit motive becomes so big sometimes. And it happened on Truvada, which is a drug used for HIV patients to stop the spread in a prophylactic sense of HIV. All the work done by the NIH. Eventually, they end up Gilead taking the drug and saying, okay, we can patent this and use it. So there's a private-public partnership that seems to me the public doesn't always get its full value for what happens because the companies are able to take them, patent them, and get exclusive profits for a 17-year period. We have the longest drug patents of any country on the planet. We're the only country on the planet. I believe in the capitalist system. I believe in free enterprise. So I get this, but we're the only country on the planet that allows them unfettered pricing power. Everybody else negotiates. So if you want to make a certain profit on a drug, and Germany, England, France, and everybody else have negotiated the price to X, and you want to bring your profit margins up, the only place still to do it is in the United States.
Right.
So you bring the price up to the breaking point until the point where no insurance company will cover it. And that's the problem. We are subsidizing in the United States the research, development, and some of the profit margins for the rest of the world, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, you put that really well in the book, too, comparing how European countries deal with this. I just had Matt Ridley on the podcast. He has a new book out called How Innovation Works, and he's pretty critical of the patent system and intellectual property system and laws that protect intellectual property, not from the individual perspective, but from the kind of society perspective. It doesn't hinder innovation to not have patent laws and property, intellectual property rights. People still do innovate anyway.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because you think of it, and I'm sure Matt talks about this. The idea of the patent system is to encourage small entrepreneurs and inventors sitting inside a lab that if they come up with something, it won't be stolen by a big company down the block. Right. They'll be able to actually get some protection on it. Instead, all of the researchers and scientists who are doing the research to come up with these new drugs inside of Gilead and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, they automatically assign, by the nature of their employment agreements, their patents to the company. So it's the companies that end up with the patents. And not only do they end up with the patents themselves, which we looked at in the early 1960s, bringing the term down to 5 years or 8 years, there was no incentive, no motivation to do that. So there's still 17 to 20 years. But the companies, and you will not be surprised, game the system to know how to do extensions. So you get to a point where your drug's about to expire, and now you do some molecular changes to it. You change a few atoms. The efficacies may be the same, but you're able to dose it every 6 hours instead of every 3. That's good enough for an extension on the patent. They know, and that's why, for instance, 13 patent extensions on OxyContin. Purdue was able to get over a period of time, and the champion is Lilly. 1922, they got the patent on insulin. They kept it for over 49, nearly 50 years by extension and doing variations of it. So not only do we have the patent in place, but they know how to work the system.
Now, why does the FDA not just put their foot down on that and just change the laws?
Because you know this better than everybody, because it's a separate part of the bureaucracy. Never should the bureaucracy work together. The patent office marches to its own beat. The FDA just approves the drugs. It's like, not my job. Okay, we just approve the drugs. And then the patent office says, well, not my job. We just enforce the laws as they are. And that really has to come from Congress. The idea of shortening that patent period would be very interesting. And one of the things when in the early 60s, when the Senate was thinking of doing it, Estes Kefauver, the crusading Tennessee senator who had gone against the mafia, he wanted to not only shorten the patent period, But if you didn't shorten it, he wanted to force the companies to have to license their products after a certain amount of time, 3, 4, 5 years, and cap the amount that they could license it at. Now, that's managed care. I understand that was fought immediately as socialism and everything else. Everybody hated that idea.
Yeah.
But, somewhere in between Kefauver's idea and the idea of doing nothing at all, there may be a solution.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was out on a bike ride and got a bee sting, which I get periodically. And for some reason, I swelled up and I almost blacked out. My wife took me to the ER and, he'd do the EpiPen stuff. And why don't you have an EpiPen with you? I'm like, all right. So I'm recovered. I go down to the pharmacy. All right, I guess I'll take 2 of them. I have one on my bike and one in my car or whatever. It's like, okay, here goes $650. I'm like, what?
Isn't that fantastic? And when I talk about that in the book, so you have that EpiPen section, there are 2 things about it. So first, 650 here in the U.S. versus 100, 125 across the border in Canada or in Europe.
Right.
When the chairman, when she came in to talk to Congress about the price of EpiPens, they asked her 2 things. She was the daughter, by the way, of Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia.
Oh, right.
So a little sidelight there. There are connections all around. But she was asked, how much, by the way, some of the high prices on drug items come from these so-called middlemen, pharmacy benefit managers that make the formulary list. If you're not on Medicare and getting a prescription D plan, you have a regular health plan, you're covered from some medications, and sometimes the doctor will prescribe something to you. You have to look to see if it's covered on your list. Is it on the formulary as a 2, 3, or 4? Do you pay more for it? The companies that choose what drugs are on those get rebates sometimes from the pharmaceutical companies to put those on. EpiPen had been doing that. And the congressman asked her, what part of the $650 price goes to the rebate? And she said, I actually don't know, which is true because it's all opaque. There's no transparency. That's a bad answer to have to give. If we have a system where some of the pricing is because middlemen are getting money that's legal to be able to put something on a formulary, I'd like to have a little bit more of an openness on that. One thing, when I talk to OxyContin, the victims, the families, those who have lost children sometimes to OxyContin, one of the things they often did not know that OxyContin in the United States costs 300 to 400% more than OxyContin abroad in the UK or in Europe. So not only were people getting addicted here, but they were paying a higher price than anywhere else in the world. People are flabbergasted to find that out, but that's America.
It is a screwy system. I'll just give you one funny little story. The only med I take is a 10 milligram statin for slightly high cholesterol. So anyway, I had a blood test a few weeks ago, and I go in to get my refill, and they go, well, it's 20 milligrams now. And, it's $3 or whatever for 3 months because I'm on Medicare. I'm like, oh, okay, but I really just want to stick with the 10 milligrams. I think that was a statistical anomaly because I know my blood pretty well. And they go, well, if you want the 10 milligrams, that's like $60. I'm like, what?
Isn't it fantastic? So what's happened on that, that's very interesting. So what has happened for whatever reason is pharmaceutical companies decided to tilt the pricing method for the 20 milligram, and that the formulary and the pharmacy benefit managers, for whatever reason, are tilting it toward the 20 milligram. Why, I don't know, but they have some reason. It's not because they're making more money on it, clearly, because they're pricing it so much less. They're trying to phase out the 10. I'm not sure, but when you have price incentives, it's being established between the manufacturer and the distributor. It's not being established by the pharmacist, even independent pharmacists. If you're not going to Walgreens, CVS, you're not going to any of the big ones, you go to a local independent pharmacist. They don't set the price. They're passing along the price. They're making a little bit of money at the end, but it's being set before that by the big players.
Yeah, and maybe because I'm on Medicare now, maybe that changes how that's calculated.
Well, what's interesting is that on Medicare and on Medicaid is the golden fleece. If we had still Senator, doing all the golden fleece awards, right? He would be hitting this all the time. Since every drug approved by the FDA has to be covered by Medicaid. So if you happen to have a drug that you need because you have a rare genetic illness and it's $400,000 a year, Medicaid cannot deny to cover that drug. Medicare can with your Part D. But Medicaid, you have to cover. So what happens is many of the companies with the highest priced drugs go to doctors who have largely Medicaid patients, looking for patients that might be able to use a drug for a condition they're not even aware of that might help them. And therefore, it's billions of dollars sometimes in extra cost for a given drug. And the result is the companies pay fines for over-marketing to patients because they know they're going to get paid on it. And it's a racket. I reported in the book, and it's one of those things you think we could fix this, but no politician wants to have an instance in which one poor person on Medicaid goes on local TV or national TV and says, my daughter has a rare genetic illness and up to last month was able to get a drug to help her control this. And now the president, the governor, or Congress wants to take that right away to save a few dollars. None of them want to be there.
Right. Yeah, I have no idea what the solution is to our healthcare problem. It is such a mess. It's so complex. There's so many players, and it's a third rail for politicians. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And your book just made it worse because it's like, if you have a lot of money and lawyers, nothing is going to happen. They just tie it up in the courts for decades.
Yeah, you're right. And sometimes I'm asked, what's the solution?
Yeah.
I don't have a solution. I'm good at raising the problem.
Yeah.
But there's no easy fix. That's for sure. There are some easy things, famous last words, that a president could do. They could issue an executive order, for instance, to require transparency on the middlemen, those pharmacy benefit managers. That's fine. They could close the loopholes on the orphan drugs, and that would help a little bit on the problem. But here's what's amazing to me. People say, is this against Democrats or Republicans? I say it's against both parties, a pox on both parties, because neither has had the courage to stand up to the pharmaceutical lobby. And the best example of that is, if anybody's going to, in the current parties, it would be the Democrats with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. We just had the HEROES Act passed, which was a $3 trillion House package that the House knows will not be approved by the Senate. There are a handful of progressives, including Lloyd Doggett, who wanted to get language in there that they called anti-profiteering language on vaccines and treatments for COVID. Just no price gouging. Put it in there. And the drug companies pushed back and said, this is the wrong time for this language because it's going to take away the incentive in the labs. We're working on cures. And as a result, the leadership, Nancy Pelosi, wouldn't even put it in the wish list of the HEROES Act. So you talk about the sanctity of the drug lobby. Both sides, not that they're in their pockets, but they get a lot of drug money. They're lobbied very heavily, and they've both been very friendly to the pharmaceutical industry for decades.
Maybe they're like the NRA for guns, something like that.
Yeah, I think that, it's very interesting. Although in this sense, I think it's a very good analogy. The NRA seems to be an easier target, for people to coalesce around and say, okay, we like that, we don't like it. But there's no single drug lobby. There's a Pharma. It's called PHRMA, which is the industry's leading group. But there are many of the patient advocacy groups that you see out there for unusual small disease. They're funded by drug companies. Nothing wrong with that. But they are advocating for the drug to be approved by Congress and to be paid for by the government because they want it covered. So it's harder to get a handle. There is no NRA in terms of one institution. And it represents the people with the
equivalent of Wayne LaPierre saying the only thing that kills a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Yeah, that's kind of a simple target.
No equivalent.
So, well, with the COVID-19 and now the riots, the week we're speaking, the whole opioid crisis has kind of been pushed off the front page. I don't even see it in the New York Times anywhere. Or LA Times. So where's the status of all that now? That crisis?
It's interesting because, as you know, my second last chapter is called "The Coming Pandemic," and it ends with the infectious disease expert telling me in 2016 that the next pandemic isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. So here it is.
Yeah.
I published on March 10th. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic. So I figured, I didn't think that was going to happen. And I think we will come back to the pandemic, obviously, in the next few weeks. But here's the question. We have become increasingly, since the Gulf War in 1990, one topic at a time news society. It seems as though one topic saturates the cable news at night, the evening news, the newspaper coverage. All the reporters are put on that issue. So we go from impeachment, and then all of a sudden it's COVID, and then now it's race relations. And next, I think it goes back to COVID if there's a second kick up, but it could be anything else. That we have the election coming up. We seem to be incapable in the media of covering 2, 3, or 4 issues at once. And I'm absolutely befuddled by why that is.
Yeah. Well, it may get back to the economics of marketing news when they have to compete against social media. I don't know. Yeah, it remains to be seen. So what you're saying is that I think the number you gave in the book was 52,000 a year are dying of opioid overdoses. And that number hasn't gone down. Or what about all these lawsuits and the cracking down on the pill dispensers and all that? Does that help?
Yes. I mean, it definitely helps. As a matter of fact, the numbers went down. I think I report in the book that in the last year, they have reported through 2017, there was a first dip. that we see now. The question is that a dip that starts a trend, or is it an anomaly that goes back up? But the pill doctors, and this is interesting, it's like whack-a-mole. You knock one down, and another one opens up. We saw it here in Broward, north of us. 6% of the doctors in the country are prescribing over 90% of all the opioids. That's an astonishing figure. So you have heavy prescribers. Some of them legit, but many of them not. So the pill doctors were tough to get a control on. And I think that we have seen more Americans die from the opioid crisis, prescription drugs, than died in the Civil War. That's an astonishing figure. It's gone on for a long time. And the lawsuits, over 2,000 of them, are consolidated now in a bankruptcy proceeding. Purdue has filed bankruptcy, left with $500 million in cash. But the Sacklers, 8 members of the family who were directors and ran it as president and directors of the corporation, they asked the bankruptcy court to provide them protection, stay all the lawsuits against them, and see if they could come up with a settlement for the all the lawsuits. And the bankruptcy court has done that, which is really extraordinary, because normally if you're not a party to the bankruptcy, you don't get protected. So the Sackler family is under that protection. They have until October to try to come up with a deal. And I think that they may well strike a deal that will allow them a multi-billion-dollar settlement, to the real disappointment of many of the victims. You know, I have a chapter in there about a mother who lost her daughter, named sort of a warrior, Marianne Skolick, against Purdue. You messed with the wrong mother. There are a lot of activists like her who will think there's never enough punishment for Purdue.
So they could conceivably be hit with, say, $2 or $3 billion settlement, and they'll still have several billion in their pockets. So you hit the nail on the head. I mean, as a matter of fact, and why you say, how do we know that? It's not just guesswork of that. It's a private company. I haven't seen their tax reporting, but I rely on Forbes, which put them in 2015 for the first time, they entered the richest American families list in 2015 with a net worth of $14 billion. Wow. And they called them the Oxy Clan. That was Forbes' word for them. So this is the children of the 3 brothers, right? Yeah, it's actually one of the brothers. So one of the brothers, Raymond, who died just a few years ago, his wife, Beverly, who just died last year, they were directors until the end. They are the 2 members of the family that were the card-carrying members of the Communist Party from the 1940s. And Raymond was the youngest brother. He died. Then Beverly, who was the last of that generation, died. And it was really the children of Raymond, who was Richard Sackler. He was the president. The children of the original founders were the ones who carried it on, and then the grandchildren to some extent. And they work at the company, right? Well, they were directors. One of them was married to a so-called performance artist, and so they worked at the company. But they also, there's interesting things here. They have a company, a multi-billion-dollar company abroad called Mundi Pharma, World Drugs, and they have. I disclosed in 2018 in Britain, they ran an operation for nearly 20 years out of their British subsidiaries, selling OxyContin in the rest of Europe from a company based in the UK. They sold it at a low price, at nearly cost, to a company in Bermuda that they owned. Then that company was the one that sold it at a big profit to the rest of the world. Guess what? Bermuda companies pay no taxes. Guess what? Number 2, they didn't ship it to Bermuda. They just did it on paper. And number 3, it wasn't illegal. So this is when you say things that make your head want to just blow off, you get so aggravated. They gamed the system for 20 years in a legal way. The British have now changed that tax law as a result of that. But you see time and time again how it was done. And I think what you mentioned before, they get away with it in part because they were private individuals. This wasn't a public company stepping on it, so somebody would see it. They were able to do it in another way. I also enjoyed your chapters on the kind of the New York art scene and Sackler funding or providing monies to the Metropolitan and other museums, I'm sure, and how all that works. It's just crazy. It is an unusual world in the art scene, but even there, the Sacklers were able to always come in and drive the best bargain. So, they get naming rights at a point when nobody, after the 6-Day War, nobody in New York, the big art patrons, wanted to fund an Egyptian temple called the Temple of Dendur for the Metropolitan Museum. The Arab-Israeli War had soured them all on that. So Sackler was able to do it at a bargain price and work it out for a 20-year payment by the brothers to get naming rights. But the Sacklers, interestingly enough, in the beginning of their rise in the drug industry, Arthur Sackler, the patriarch, had pretended he was Catholic. Although he was Jewish, the industry was a lot of wasp. It wasn't very heavily Jewish. So he didn't advertise that fact. Later, when he felt comfortable enough to be Jewish openly, it turns out that he felt as though he was snubbed by the Metropolitan Museum of Art because they were all WASP at the top, and they weren't putting him on the board of directors because he was Jewish. It's an unusual story. See, that's what I mean by the temperament he had of being kind of competitive, even as he's sort of a competitive philanthropist. I'm going to be the best philanthropist. I'm going to get the best deals.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And as a matter of fact, a $7 million gift to Harvard puts naming rights on Harvard. They do it at Tufts. They do it at Tel Aviv at the university in London, the Serpentine Gallery. You're talking about people, they knew what they wanted, and they gave away a lot of money. But in each instance, it was a monument to themselves. It stood up there. And one of the things that Arthur Sackler's wife, his third wife, has tried to do is to say, when there's been this controversy over the naming rights, people want to take the name Sackler off the buildings at universities. Right. She says Arthur died before there was OxyContin. He did, in fact, die, 9 years before OxyContin came out. So he really didn't earn any of the money from OxyContin, keep his name on. Yeah. But it's very difficult when you have a name that's up there that is, the poster child for this great epidemic, to say, well, one brother was before. So we'll leave his name on the buildings he gave to. Yeah,
the association alone could doom them. Yeah, then I was also reminded of that 60 Minutes piece, I don't know, a year or two ago, of that one of the pill dispensers, I think in Miami. And just the numbers of like how many pain clinics there were in one mile stretch, more than McDonald's or anything else. And the one guy was in jail. And so the 60 Minutes correspondent is asking him, this guy is still defensive. It's like, here we have a script for 1,000 OxyContin pills to a pregnant woman. What are you thinking? He goes, well, she was in a lot of pain. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. I always say denial is not just a river in Egypt, right? It's a fabulous process. And I remember going through, we live in Miami-Dade. We'd go up to Broward, which was the area where the pill mills were. And actually, Tricia and I, we went to a chiropractor who was next door to a pill mill. Now, the fabulous thing is the first time we ever saw a pill mill, went in, it looked like they're normal houses. The chiropractor was operating out of his house. The place next door looked like a house along this strip, but there was an armed guard in front. And there was a line of people that went down this residential block. And we said to the chiropractor, what is that? He said, that's an opioid dispensing clinic. Those people were coming in when we left. We looked at the license plates from Georgia. They were coming in from Kentucky. They were driving in. At that time in Florida, if you paid cash for your prescription, you got the maximum amounts given. Those places were dispensing the drug on the premises. They were allowed to do that. You didn't have to go to a pharmacy. Then you could go to another dispenser a mile or a block away or 2 blocks away and get a new prescription filled, because nobody was keeping track of how many prescriptions were filled for the same person. It was essentially legal drug operations in the state.
So presumably that's been cracked down on now.
That has been cracked down. The Wild West days of opioid prescribing are finally over, although what they've been replaced with. So, the doctors, some went to jail and some didn't, but you now drive along the route where all these doctors' clinics were. We noticed recently that a lot of them have sort of billboards that say aging miracles, growth hormone, to reverse aging. So they become anti-aging clinics. God knows what goes on inside of there.
Oh my God. Yes. Well, they're appealing to us baby boomers.
That's right.
As we approach the wall. Yes. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, Gerald. Back to COVID-19, since you've been dealing with pharmaceutical companies, do you think there's a chance we'll get a vaccine in a year or two, or is it possible we'll never get one?
Before COVID, I would have said there's always a possibility you'll never get one. But I will tell you, Michael, I'm in touch regularly with some of the infectious disease doctors I interviewed in the book, and they give me confidence. They are confident that one will be found. And the reason for that is the disease mutates this virus, but not radically. It doesn't mutate as fast as HIV. So as long as it stays in its lane, its mutations are narrow, they're able to develop a vaccine to treat it. Plus, they had a head start. They were developing a vaccine really for H1N1, which was the predecessor. They were looking at vaccines for SARS and MERS, 2 COVID-related diseases back in 2003, 2005. They stopped those because it turned out that the viruses sort of petered out, so there never was enough money to finish them. But now they're picking up that research. The real question becomes, the lay public thinks that once they hear success, a vaccine approved, end game, that's it. But no, that's when the real process starts of gearing up for manufacturing it. We're going to have to distribute 1 billion to 2 billion doses in the first 2 years to get that level of herd immunity that really starts to push the virus out of this system. And then they'll eventually may inoculate up to 3 billion. That's going to take 6 months to 8 months to get those numbers. So initially, it's going to go to first-line responders, hospital workers, the elderly who are at risk. There will be a fight over how it's distributed. That will play out for some time, even after we get the vaccine.
Another one of my favorite factoids from your book. By the end of the war in Europe, May 1945, American companies were producing a stunning 650 billion units monthly of penicillin. That's impressive.
That from nowhere, literally from scratch. And so you think about that, and that's the benefit. People say, well, why can't we have then the crash effort we had on penicillin for COVID?
Yeah.
The difference is, of course, it was a hot war, so your eyes are really focused on it.
Yeah.
Secondly, the government came in and sort of corralled these 10 American pharmaceutical companies into doing it, but we built the plants for them as the taxpayers. We built the fermentation tanks and everything else to give them that capacity. And then we made sure that nobody owned the rights to it. So when the war ended, penicillin's price plummeted to near nothing. The companies had to have some innovation to come up with new antibiotics like streptomycin, aramycin, and others to be able to come up with their drugs with patents. So now with COVID, there is no crash program because the companies won't give up their rights.
Right.
They all are racing to come up with a patent that they can use and license to somebody else. So that has changed the specter of how you do a crash effort.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you say to the anti-vaxxers that I don't mean the crazy conspiracy theorists, but just this idea of forcing people to get vaccinated? I don't want to vaccinate my kid. Why should I?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I had somebody tell me recently who doesn't believe in vaccines, and they were, as you said, they're a more reasonable anti-vaxxer. If you want to get vaccinated and you think it's worthwhile, and the vaccine is going to protect you from the virus, then why do I have to get vaccinated? Because you'll be protected. And I thought that was an interesting argument, throwing it around and saying we can opt out. So I think there will definitely be people, just as we can't get people to wear masks. Look, they refuse sometimes to wear a mask to go to a place because they don't think it's worthwhile. You're going to have people who say, I don't want to get it. I don't think it's safe. I want to wait to see what the first year is like. It's against my civil liberties. And the only way, the real test case on this will be, we never had this with when it came, let's say, to polio, because people are more willing to go forward and take the vaccine. But the FAA, for instance, could say that if you don't have a vaccination certificate, you can't fly. That's a federal rule. They can ban you from getting on a plane. Now, a lot of people don't want to fly right now. I understand that. But when things get back to being normal, if you can't go off for a destination or go for a vacation or a trip or business because you don't have a vaccination certificate, the government can force the issue. But I don't know if they will have the stomach to. We'll have to see. Yeah,
well, right. You don't have to vaccinate your kid, but he can't go to public school.
Yeah, so you see that taking place. And so what that has led to, I have found out, and I might include this in the paperback, is a small black market in what I call fake vaccination certificates.
Oh, right.
Doctors who are willing to say, they believe really that it's not good, but they provide them for your child to say, yes, they got them. And then your child does go to school anyway. And so probably there would be a third-party market or underground market even for fake vaccination.
There was something like that, I think, in Oregon. An excessive number of religious exemptions were written by like one doctor. And it's obviously that's what it was. It wasn't religious at all. It was political, really. Yeah, I just did this show, Brian Rose's show, London Real, and he had on that David Icke, who's he's sort of the Alex Jones of England for conspiracy theories, and he went on and on about 5G and all that. But then, then I gave the standard why vaccines are great history and how effective they are, and man, I got just hammered. Like, this is my freedom, my liberty, and my body, and it's like. But the freedom to swing your arm ends at my nose. There's a harm principle here. You're not free to drive on the left side of the road. You give up freedoms all the time for security. Yeah, no, that's absolutely. It's so interesting that, and the idea of we're all in this together. The idea that there's a shared commonality that you may be an asymptomatic carrier, that you might infect somebody who's more vulnerable, and therefore the vaccine will benefit everybody, including those you come into contact with. There are a lot of people who just refuse to buy that. I see that. I don't know. Well, yeah, I'm disinclined to have the government force people to get a vaccine, but restrictions like you can't fly or you can't send your kid to public schools, that's reasonable too. Because I should be free to be free from your germs. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about freedom, I mean, there's those. I'm sure you've seen those viral videos of that woman in, I think it was a Costco, without a mask, coughing into the face of the employee, asking her to put on a mask, and it's like, oh man. I'm free to do whatever I want. No, you're not. No, it's absolutely true. Crazy. True. Yeah. Well, Gerald, thank you for coming on the show. We're going an hour and 30 minutes here, so I'm going to let you go. Thank you for writing the book. This is really maybe your most important book at this particular moment in history. Certainly, every book, Michael, feels like the most difficult book, and it's the one that I'm most passionate about. And I'm certainly on fire about this book, and it affects people in a different way. God's bankers had them up in arms about what the Vatican was doing in money. But this is something different because we all take a pill.
We all fill a prescription. We've had some part of the drug business as the consumer, as the buyer, as the eventual buyer. And although we have a feeling as though we know what the pharmaceutical industry is like, when you read its history, you think, okay, I understand what their DNA is like. I shouldn't expect them to be the Joan of Arcs and the Mother Teresas of the world. They're going to be looking for a profit. So can they do better at times? Do they come up with life-saving drugs, great cures, and things that help us? No question about it. And do they also sometimes cross the line and downplay side effects and make too much money on a drug? No question about it. And it's why it's an interesting business.
Well, it certainly is. Actually, one last question. How many pills have been produced and taken in 100 years? It must be trillions and trillions.
You know, it's a great question because I know them by years. I know that Valium on its big year had over 3 billion tablets sold in the U.S. alone. And that OxyContin had billions of tablets. So if we added them all up, that's a great thing. We should actually get some supercomputer down at the NSA.
1,000, so a trillion is 1,000 billion. I bet you could easily get to 1,000 billion if you took all the different drugs.
No question. No question.
That's staggering.
Yeah, it really is.
A lot of chemicals.
It is a lot of chemicals from an industry always looking at how to come up with the next chemical because it knows that it only makes the money if it comes up with something new, not necessarily revolutionary, but new means a patent. New means a different part. Right.
So last question, what's your next big project? Are you thinking about anything yet?
Not yet. I'm still
nothing on the back burner. Yeah.
Tricia has some ideas. She's looking at a few ideas for a project for herself, and I am, but we can't really get out of pharma.
What was Tricia's last book? I forget.
Her last book was The Pharmacist of Auschwitz. It's the first nonfiction about the Bayer pharmacist. He's Romanian, who ends up running the dispensary at Auschwitz, steals enough gold from the mouth of the dead to open up a pharmacy after the war, and then stays free until one camp survivor and Germany's first post-war Jewish judge bring him to some semblance of justice in the mid-'60s. The Pharmacist of Auschwitz. It was
oh my God, that's a great story. I got to read that book. That sounds great.
Yeah, it's only 200 pages. When I say only 200, Tricia she's great. She tells the story very, very tight. I tell a story with a lot of footnotes and asides and that. So go to Tricia. I'm her researcher when she does a book. She's my researcher. Otherwise, I would say to her, Tricia, what about this? You could add this in about Bayer. And she would say, nope, that's not my story. I'm writing about Capesius. That's his name. And so she stays right on a good story.
That's funny. More disciplined.
Absolutely.
But frankly, I loved all your footnotes and the little asides and stuff. So, Gerald, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your work. I'm a huge fan, and I really appreciate all that.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all the work at the Skeptic Society. You do the great work of keeping reason alive, reason and logic, which are in short supply. Thank you for your work.
We're trying.